Hello, this next video is about the origins of the state in China, Korea, and Japan. So we'll be starting off in China, thinking about some philosophies there and some examples of art that demonstrate Confucianism and Taoism, and then moving on to Korea and finally to Japan, where we'll also talk about Shinto. So starting off with Confucius and Confucianism. So Confucius was an individual that lived in 551 BCE. He was born into a declining aristocratic family, was well educated, of course very literate. He was very much desiring a just and harmonious society. He was living in a time of warfare during the Zhou dynasty. He had this ideal of a gentleman, someone who engaged in moderation, did not overindulge, a man of integrity, self-control, loyalty, and altruism, very important features of the ideal gentleman for Confucius. He was very interested in relationships where there was a superior individual and a more inferior individual, but where there was respect on both sides. So you have this idea of parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger sibling, elder friend and younger friend, and then ruler and subject. And Confucius, of course, Confucius and Confucianism, the theories behind it were very beneficial to the ruler because of the idea of the respect that a subject was supposed to give to the ruler of China. So of course there are pros and cons to this type of philosophy. It leads to a very harmonious society when people are always paying respect to those who are considered superior to them, if you have this kind of social structure, but of course it doesn't lead to a lot of individuality. However, if we think about Lao Tzu and Taoism, this was a philosophy and eventually a religion, Taoism, that emphasizes this kind of individuality, a return to nature, less emphasis on humans, more emphasis on nature. A Taoist sage seeks a quiet life, a return to a state of nature. The Tao is the way or the path. And there's an idea of life force or energy that's often represented in art that is connected to Taoism. We'll see some examples of that in just a few minutes. Also, the idea of yin and yang is emphasized in Taoism. So the idea of yin is the passive or female dark side, and yang is the active light male side. And so pros and cons here can be, in Taoism you are permitted to be more individualistic. There's less of that kind of rigid structure that we see with Confucianism, but it could lead to quite a chaotic society if everyone is being too individualistic. So just something to think about. So the dynasty that we start off in this video is Qin China, and so the Qin dynasty developed after a period of the warring states. This was a period of a long period of warfare. On the left side, of course, you can see the number of provinces that were essentially battling it out for power, but eventually we have this first ruler or first emperor of Qin, the first emperor who will unify a good amount of China. And so we see this Qin dynasty, which is where we actually get the name China. The capital was near the modern city of Xi'an, just for reference. We also see this first emperor of Qin really starting to have an interest in defining what China is through this unified area. He commissioned the first iteration of the Great Wall, which we can see here along the northern border of his empire. It was created out of rammed earth or pounded earth, which is essentially earth that has been pounded to such an extent that it's about half of its size. It's almost like concrete. It's incredibly strong. Also, he standardized weights and measures, currency, to really create a very unified empire in China. Let's have a look at the first emperor of Qin's tomb. Very, very famous site, the tomb of Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin, who died in 214 BCE. It is a huge tourist attraction in China today. The tumulus itself has not been excavated, so we do not have access to what we call the kind of underground city or underground palace, because according to the grand historian Sima Qian, who wrote it during the Han Dynasty, a later dynasty, There was a beautiful palace recreated here that had rivers of mercury, essentially recreating the empire so that the first emperor of Qin could continue to rule a wonderful empire in his afterlife. So we see a lot of these tombs continuing on from the Zhou and the Shang previously, the idea that you want to bring everything with you. You want to continue the life that you're having today into the afterlife. But they have actually scanned some of it, so they do know that there is basically an underground palace here. They just haven't excavated it to see exactly what's there. There are stories about the people who worked on this tomb actually being locked in. So the grand historian tells us that at the end, they didn't want these artisans to reveal the tomb secrets. So it was said they were locked in and essentially died there with the ruler. Also, it was said that the wives of the first emperor who did not have any sons were also essentially killed and put in the tomb with the ruler. Again, this comes from a later historian, so we're not sure if it's 100% true, but it makes for a good story. The most famous part of this particular site is this infantry pit. So we can see in this particular infantry pit that we have thousands, in fact, it's thought to be more than 7,000 terracotta warriors. So these terracotta warriors are about a mile away from the tumulus, and it's said to defend a particular side of the tumulus. If we look in this particular site, you can see that the terracotta army is right over here, so a good distance from the tumulus itself, but you can get a sense of how massive this tomb was and how many people had to work on this particular tomb. So why have these thousands of terracotta warriors? So some people have often asked, why didn't he actually kill his army and bring them into the tomb with him? Because it was common practice among some rulers to bring certain people with you into the afterlife. Of course, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to kill your warriors because his son did take over after him, and so he would be left without an army. He did not rule for very long, however. The Han Dynasty will come in relatively quickly. But this idea that he wants to have an enduring army, and so by having these terracotta warriors, he has an army that will essentially last forever. So they're in this perfect alignment. There are all the different ranks. We have archers, generals, infantrymen. Each face is individualized. Some people have theorized that these are portraits. However, we believe that the artists just went about trying to individualize them to make them as much like a real army. I don't think the warriors actually sat for portraits. They just made each one slightly different. Some of the body parts were made through molds. Some people have theorized that some of them were done using a coiling method. However, we do believe that most of the body parts were made through a mold method, but there are many publications about these different theories. So the idea is that the emperor is protected, but of course he takes a lot of other things with him in this elaborate tomb. I wanted to show you that the original terracotta warriors would have been brightly colored. They would have had a lacquer coating, which would have helped to preserve them. The idea that he wanted these enduring warriors. So terracotta baked clay will last an amazing amount of time. Lacquer too will add a layer of protection. It was incredibly time consuming to add this layer of lacquer. But the idea was to make sure these warriors would last forever. Unfortunately, they became wet, and so as they're excavated, this color flakes off very quickly, but they are working on a way of preserving that color. So let's move on to the Han Dynasty, the dynasty that will come after the Qin Dynasty, and we're going to look at an example of a tomb model house from this period. So this tomb model house gives us a sense of Han Dynasty architecture. It's important to look at these examples. You'll often see them at museums where they have ancient Chinese collections because often people were buried with these as a way to give them a home away from home, but it gives us a sense of the architecture that no longer survives. So this is what we presume upper class Han architecture would have looked like, very vertical in its orientation, large eaves the way we see in later Chinese architecture. There's a frontal courtyard. We also see some painting along the outside of the building. But just this idea that, again, into the Han Dynasty, we see this interest in bringing things with you and creating a home away from home. One of the most magnificent burials from the Han Dynasty was for a woman who's referred to as Lady of Dai. Her particular burial is a great example of connecting to Taoism, but I wanted to show you her corpse and the system where her corpse was buried. She was in many nested coffins, and the corpse itself was wrapped in silk. The outermost layer of boxes was packed with over 1,000 luxury items. She had a shaft tomb similar to Lady Fu Hao, which we saw from the Shang Dynasty. She had silks, lacquer vessels, musical instruments, and the boxes were encased in 5 tons of charcoal and a layer of clay several feet thick and rested on bamboo mats. This absorbed moisture, and so when she was discovered, her body was nearly perfectly preserved. They were able to examine her body and determine that she was middle-aged when she died. She had arthritis and atherosclerosis and probably died of a heart attack. So very striking to see this particular woman who was preserved so perfectly, which really gives us that sense of how they believed you really were going to make it into an afterlife. And we'll see this change when we get to Buddhism. So what were these nested coffins? We see lots of interesting iconography on the coffins. Here I'm just showing you a detail of one of the coffins so that you can see these wisps. And so these wisps are often called wisps of qi or wisps of life force, connecting to this Taoist concept. We also see possibly Taoist immortals who seem to be riding these wisps of qi. So again, connecting to this philosophy which originated a long time before, but there was a strong interest among the upper classes at this point. So Lady of Dai, of course, was part of the aristocracy. It's clear that she was a woman of great wealth to have a tomb of this status and to have these many objects in her tomb. One of the most famous objects, in addition to the coffin, is her painted silk banner, which was placed on her coffin. It may have been processed in the funerary procession, or it may have been the banner to represent her soul. But you have an interesting connection to sun and moon. You also have a representation probably of Lady of Dai herself. There is a bat represented, which was a symbol of happiness. And then lower down you have this connection to her funeral. So you have these layers of the underworld, the terrestrial realm, and the heavens. So let's have a look at this kind of breakdown. So you have that heavenly realm up above, and then the bat, and then connecting. Lady of Dai is represented here with attendants. She is seen as a larger woman, but she looks like she's kind of struggling, like she's getting older. And then you see a bee disc represented, which we've talked about as being connected to the heavens. And then also you see this kind of funerary scenes where her body, her corpse, might actually be represented in the background covered in a cloth. So an interesting breakdown with the idea of registers, these kind of levels of existence or being, with the heavenly realm, the terrestrial realm, and more of an underworld or subterranean realm. And here's just a close-up where you get the sense of the bee disc that I was referring to, the funerary scene with these bronze objects. There you can see a close-up, and then Lady of Dai with her attendants. I also wanted to talk about the tomb of Lo Sheng. He had a very large rock-cut tomb, very, very large in size. He was a ruler of a territory, and his father was an emperor, so he was really well connected. His tomb speaks to his wealth because it is full, of course, of bronze vessels, lacquerware, pottery, and clay figures. His tomb also connects to Taoism. He was discovered he was buried in a funerary suit, which presents an interest in immortality, the idea that the hope of this jade suit, this precious idea of jade, helping this individual to make it into the afterlife, to protect him, or possibly to turn him into an immortal. So his body was encased in these small pieces of jade sewn together with gold wire, so extraordinary in terms of its materials. He also had bee discs on his chest and on his back, and then he had a jade Kong or song around his genitalia. So he's very much preserved in many different areas. But the idea of keeping in the vital breath and again, trying to make sure he can make it to the afterlife. Another funerary object, or something that was discovered in his tomb, was a censer, an incense burner, where the incense could rise out of these small holes in this burner to create the effect of mist rising off of a mountain. The mountain itself reminds us of the mountains where the immortals would reside, according to Taoist thought, and also it looks like little beings seem to emerge out from this mountain. It's a very luxurious item, and it also hints at the coming interest in landscape in Chinese painting, which we'll see later on in these videos. A nice examples, we've seen some examples of Taoism, but a nice example of Confucianism we can see in the Wu family shrine. So these were a number of offering halls that are in really rough condition now, but there were rubbings that were taken of these low reliefs. And just to go through some basics here, we get a sense of reverence for a ruler in these particular rubbings. So we can see here the ruler, people are bowing to him. These two are bowing rather dramatically, a slight bow from this larger gentleman here. We see this figure very large who is paying his respects back to them, but is clearly the individual of the highest status. There are attendants in the background here, and then there seem to be women above, possibly the queen at center here who's frontal, and then the other attendants who are in profile. So there are indications of who the most important figures are, and then who is paying respect to those figures. So the Wu family shrines are often nice indications of Confucianism continuing to be important in terms of rulership. And the Wu family, they were upper class, they were connected to scholars and officials in the government system. So let's move on to Korea. We're going to be focusing in on the Three Kingdoms period and looking at Shilla. We'll be going to Gyeongjo, where we find some of the most impressive tombs. If we go into the old tomb park, we find the largest of the burials, the Hwangnam Daecheong tomb, where we have a north tomb and a south tomb. And focusing in on the north tomb, we believe this to be the Queen's tomb. There's some different publications on this, but we believe this to be the Queen's tomb, which is interesting because it's slightly larger. So there's some different ideas as to why this might be. Maybe she outlived her husband, but these were very impressive tombs, difficult to penetrate, and in fact, very luxurious items did survive. The Shilla kingdom was rich in gold and valuable materials. So of course, what we find in these tombs are gorgeous metalwork, including a gold crown. So from the north mound of the Hwangnam Daecheong tomb is this particular crown, which indicates a connection to nature and possibly the idea that the rulers were not only rulers but also shaman, because we do see some connections between the type of shamanism practiced in Siberia. So we have here a crown that looks almost to be like a tree emerging outward. This is often called a cosmic tree or an axis mundi, a connection between the heaven and the earth. And of course, a lot of rulers claimed a connection to the gods or to the heavens. In China, we have the idea of the mandate of heaven for the ruler. And so we have this idea in Korea where there's possibly a connection to the heavens or a connection to the spiritual world that the ruler has access to. So this idea of an axis mundi or a cosmic tree. Also, of course, antlers. So deer become a symbolic creature. We see this across a variety of cultures in East Asia, and the idea of the antlers as renewal and growth and the positive symbolism of that. We also see these kind of comma-shaped jade pieces, which were symbols of fertility, almost like ripening fruit or growing fruit. Also, they've been discussed almost looking like seeds, so again, the idea of growth and fertility. Another object found in the North Tomb is this particular belt, very luxurious, probably decorated with these auspicious symbols. So these probably spoke to the virtues of the ruler, but also were supposed to protect the ruler. However, some people have suggested the origin of these types of belts were like tool belts, and then they became more ornamental objects. So just some lovely examples of metalwork that possibly have some origins to Central Asia and indicate some connections between Korea and Central Asia, but also the wealth and significance of Shilla at this point in the Three Kingdoms period in Korea. So we're going to finish up in Japan with the Kofun period, or the Old Mound or Old Tomb period. We'll be looking at the area around Osaka and or Nara, around this area here, and we'll look at the large burial of Emperor Nintoku. So again, this comes from the Kofun period, and there are numerous keyhole-shaped monumental tombs. This one is the largest. It has not been fully excavated, but we presume that he was buried with bronze mirrors, swords, jewels, also ceramics, the type of objects that have been discovered in other tombs. It is larger than a pyramid. I always like to point that out, larger than the pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, just to give you a sense of the scale. You can walk around it today. That's how it looks at one of the entrances. It has multiple moats, so it is very, very well protected, but it gives you a sense of the large scale of these tombs. And of course, I want to mention that what we're looking at in Korea and Japan comes from around the 5th, 6th century, so we're looking at things that are quite a bit later than the Qin and Han dynasty in China. So there are some differences in time in the artworks we're looking at here. In addition to just the tombs themselves and luxury objects that would be buried in the tombs, we also find what are called haniwa, these clay cylinders. Haniwa were placed in curving rows around burial mounds, also in groups around a haniwa house, so sometimes they could be created in a house form, and also directly above the deceased burial chamber. So because there were these connections between China and Korea and Japan, we do think that some of these terracotta haniwa are possibly inspired by the types of terracotta objects found in Chinese tombs, like the Han Dynasty tomb model house or the terracotta warriors from the first Emperor of Qin. These haniwa do have a very distinct style, however. They connect to traditions of shamanism, possibly. This is sometimes called haniwa of a seated female shaman. So this idea of connecting to the spiritual that we've already talked about when we were looking at the Korean tombs. And finishing up, we're going to talk a bit about Shinto. Shinto means way of the gods, and it is a religion of Japan. It teaches that forests and enormous stones are sacred dwellings of the gods of nature, or these spirits called kami. And kami are prevailed upon to enter into a shrine where their powers are worshipped and their aid solicited. And so in this particular case, we're looking at one of the most important shrines at Ise. So this was dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu. It's made of natural materials, and it is rebuilt every 20 years to very, very specific specifications. And so there's this real emphasis on cleanliness and purity. When you enter into a Shinto shrine, there are rituals of washing and, again, cleanliness. There tends to be a great connection to nature. You aren't actually allowed to enter into the shrine, so you worship from the outside. And there's a mirror placed on the inside because there's a story of Amaterasu where she goes and hides away. And of course, you don't want the sun to do that. And so to get her to come out of her cave, she is attracted to this mirror. So they bring the mirror out to try to get her to come. The ruling family of Japan claims that they are descendants of Amaterasu. So again, this idea of the ruler linking themselves to the divine. Here you get a sense of the natural setting that it is located in, and also these are just some examples of other Shinto shrines and the torii gates that mark the entrance into a Shinto shrine. So that is the end of that.